tonight. More than 190 nations are in a huddle in Paris to hopefully seal a deal to combat climate change. CNBC's Steve Sedgwick caught up with Christina Figueres, Executive Secretary of UNFCCC, and he asked how challenging is the legal framework of that agreement going to be. Listen in to that big exclusive.
Regen PowerTech presents Climate Business.
If it were easy, it would have been done a long time ago. But the legal character of it is one of the challenges. What there is, I think, fundamentally a growing consensus is that every single element of this legally binding agreement cannot and will not have the same character of legal validity. And that is something that is difficult for us to understand because the other example that we have, the Kyoto Protocol, was, as I call it, monolithically legally binding. Every single element had the same legal nature. That is not going to be so this time around because we have a very different world. So yes, it's going to be a legally binding agreement, but several of the elements will have a different legal character. That is the challenge.
And you think you can get legally binding language into the final agreement on these INDCs, because it's not just the United States, it's even countries like India who have potential real problems about multi-year verifications?
Yes, I do think that there is a growing consensus about the need for this to be a constant improvement process. This is not understood to be a one-off deal. This is really very much a structure that will guide global economy, and hence it does have to have predictable guidance into the future.
And the blueprint for that legal agreement will have to be in place by tomorrow evening. For more on that story, I'm now joined by Rahul Tongia, who's joining me live from Bangalore. He's a fellow at Brookings Institute. And Rakesh Kamal, who's standing by me, is a program officer for the Climate Change Program at the Center for Science and Environment. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for joining us. Let me come straight to you first, Rahul. You know, in the lead up to this, to the Paris Climate Summit, the international media had clearly identified Narendra Modi as the potential deal breaker. And considering the fact that China and the US, there seems to be alignment of their interests, is it now increasingly becoming India versus rest of the developed world?
I think that's a narrative that many people would like to have, but the serious scholars, or as well as decision makers, probably understand that that's not going to stick for a bunch of reasons. First of all, in the press, historically, in the US especially, they've talked about Chindia, China and India hyphenation. There is no such thing as Chindia. China and India are two very different entities, different drivers, and the emissions are very, very different. China is approximately 4 times India's emissions. More than that, its population growth rate is much lower over the next few decades, maybe 2% is some projections, while India still will grow by several tens of percent. China already has a minimum electricity access to its citizens. Its per capita consumption is much higher. So it doesn't make sense to ask someone who's starving to go on a diet. The second reason why it doesn't make sense to say that China and, India is the key problem is because it isn't. When people say India is talking historically, that's not just because of politics or negotiation. It's because of two things that cannot be ignored. One is science. Emissions last for a very long time, especially carbon dioxide. So the emissions you did a decade ago, a century ago, they matter to science. And the second reason is those very emissions have been part of economic development by this developed world, and to some extent China as well in the recent few decades. And therefore, India is yet to develop. Now, obviously, India should develop as greenly, as cleanly as possible, but there are limits to that. And that's really what's up for discussion.
Right, Rahul. In fact, we're going to unpack some of those things that you've said. Let me come to you now, Rakesh. You know, India has put up this position that, you know, as there Rahul was also mentioning, that you can't club India with the rest of the world. India is far away from its potential economic growth frontier. Has India, in the last 3-4 days, has India been able to persuasively argue its position? What's the sense you're getting?
Definitely. I would like to say that, India has put a really good foot forward this time, mainly also because our Prime Minister, when he was there, he made he had a really clear speech addressing all the issues that India really has been talking about all these years. Even if you look at the India's climate action plan that has been just come out before the COP, it always talked about 5 major issues: equity, differentiation, or what you call it as common but differentiated responsibilities, technology transfer, finance, and capacity building.
Right.
So all these 5 have been discussed in the last few days, which is a good sign, but not all of them have been discussed the way that we would have wanted to. There has been talk about France and Japan giving finances to the GCF or through different mechanisms. There has been talk about the Solar Alliance that India has talked about.
120 countries in that.
Yes, 121 countries asking for $1 trillion. But still, there is no clear mechanism on how that money is going to come.
Right.
That is still yet to be decided. There's been talk about mission innovation, where countries would help top 20 oil-consuming countries would help each other find better technologies.
Right.
They would invest more in research and development.
Right.
There's been talk about carbon pricing, which all countries want to implement carbon pricing, but the question is, how do you implement?
Exactly. In fact, that's an important point, and Rahul, come in on that, because India's strategy is becoming increasingly clear. It realizes that it has to grow, but it is, but at the same time, it is making this really big push as far as renewable energy is concerned. So they are increasing their overall, because the government has said that their overall coal requirement is, in fact, production in India is going to go up to 1.5 billion metric tons by 2020. But at the same time, it will also set up its renewable energies levels, which will go up to 175 gigawatts by 2022. So India's strategy is becoming increasingly clear, that it realizes that it is far away from the growth frontier, but it wants renewable energy to source a large chunk of that growth.
So if you look at the energy plans portfolio of the future, a lot of people say, is the answer this, is the answer that, and nuclear is what something people talk about as being both big yet carbon neutral to a large extent. And the answer is yes, meaning all of the above. It's not as if coal could meet India's needs, and it's not as if renewables could meet India's needs. It's all of the above with efficiency, with many different pillars that will actually be needed. And that's where I think the rest of the world can help. For example, with coal, it's not as if it's going to go away, not just in the short run, because we're already on track to growing our coal needs in the short run, but even in the medium to longer run, whatever coal that gets consumed should be as efficient as possible, as clean as possible. From an Indian perspective, local air pollution is a very strong concern, in some ways to the citizens, greater concern than carbon is, which is hidden and not visible, and in some people's minds very long term. And so synergizing the drivers for what makes sense locally could go a long way to helping both reduce carbon, but also helping the economics as well as local air pollution and other factors.
Right. Rahul, did India spring a surprise when it came in and, sort of unveiled these ambitious targets as part of its commitment to INDC? Yes. But still we see that it has not sort of quelled concerns from the developed world, because China and the US, they've said they'll reach their carbon peak by 2025, 2030, but whereas India has said its intensity will come down. But despite that, has India surprised, has countries like India, Brazil surprised the developed world by the sheer ambitiousness of the targets that they've unveiled?
Yes, I completely agree with you. India, Brazil, South Africa, they have given really good, targets. People didn't really expect them to come up with such good climate action plans. Right. So, they have now an upper hand over US or China, which even China has at least, given its peak and said that it would reduce its emissions. US INDC is definitely does not add up to what their historical responsibilities have been. They don't reflect that they will be reducing their consumption patterns. So all these need to be looked in place. India definitely has an upper hand because of this. This which was not there before, and that is what's making the difference, where India now has something in hand to talk about. Previously it looked like we were beggars. Now it does not look like that. Now we are showing that we have commitment towards climate change.
Do you increasingly see now, Rahul, a clear, unambiguous strategy being put in place in India in 2015 vis-a-vis what we saw in 2009 in Copenhagen?
I think everything evolves, iterates, and improves, so comparisons are not necessarily meaningful. Certainly the targets that are laid out give a roadmap, but at the same time, what's missing in a lot of global discussions is the domestic side of the energy policy, and that has to really come together for all of this to work. Because if you say that we're going to grow renewables, the questions that would be asked on the other side is it affordable? Does it meet your needs of 24/7 power for all, which includes access and meeting the peak? The peak in India, as of now, most people would recognize is in the evening. Lighting is one of the strong drivers. And unfortunately, the sun's not very bright at 8 p.m. And so in today's technology world, renewables have a very strong role to play towards energy needs, but not necessarily capacity needs, which is an area where India still has a lot of room to grow and need to grow.
Right. Just before the summit started, Rakesh, we saw a statement being put out by John Kerry, and that created a lot of confusion. But tell me honestly, can the U.S. take the moral high ground when the U.S. itself failed to ratify the Kyoto Protocol, and many would say even the targets that they have put out are far from ambitious?
Yes, India have been termed as blockers.
Yes.
So, which is a really sad thing. I mean, India has been really trying hard on behalf of all the developing countries to fight for their moral right. You know, they need carbon space for development. They have their requirements, and that is what they have been trying to say, that we need equitable, distribution of carbon space. But that has not what has happened. For asking for your rights, you have been blamed as being blockers, which is an unfortunate incident that has happened. But still, I mean, I'm glad that India is not giving up. India has been fighting. In the past 2 days, there's been discussions about, letting go of differentiation, which would mean that letting go of all the historic emissions that the countries have done, which is not acceptable to the countries. And that is the main issue of contention right now in negotiations.
Rahul, I mean, how will the agreement take into account sort of the historical baggage as far as emissions are concerned? I mean, because I remember, like, in one of your articles, you mentioned that the fact is, at the end of the day, everybody needs to do their bit as far as saving the environment is concerned. So even there, India will have to compromise. So is there a workable solution that you see that can be captured in an agreement, which I'm being told has to be, at least the blueprint of that has to be ready by tomorrow evening?
So at a personal level, I think you're absolutely right. But I would slightly disagree whether we actually need it in this framework in terms of binding agreements, or whether we can understand the framework and then figure out some of the details later. Now let me share what I think may be one way forward. Using the carbon space or carbon commons agreement, most people would see the math very starkly, that others have consumed disproportionately. Therefore, if India wants to either say, I want to consume like you did, that's my right, or even just say, forget what you did, but now there's a total that the world is allowed to use, what's our fair share? Even if we just do that, we will go bust as a world. And so now the question is very stark. What's happened has happened. Now, for the future, for it to even come close to happening, India and developing countries will have to emit less than they otherwise should have been entitled to. Is that fair? Probably not. So if it's a opportunity for India or something they strive towards as opposed to something they're constrained towards, then there is space for this to work. And by that, it means other countries should help developing countries actually do far better in terms of decarbonizing, in terms of becoming efficient than historically any nation has ever done. If you look at the big countries, only France has ever done massive levels of decarbonization of its electricity sector, and that was not through renewables, it was through nuclear power. Even when you look at Germany and some countries which are leaders in renewables, it hasn't changed the carbon intensity nearly as much as what we'd like to come out of India. So can that burden be placed on India? No. But can
one final question? Yeah, one final question. I'm sorry, I've completely run out of time, gentlemen. One final question for you, Rakesh. One thing that India would want in that final blueprint that we will see tomorrow evening. One thing, if you were to put out, if you were to say, which is most critical.
all 5 things that India is putting forward is very critical. But the sad part of it is that climate negotiations have become more of caring for economy than for ecology.
Right.
So finance and technology are one of the main things that are being discussed.
$100 billion is what?
Yes, $100 billion is the fund. But at the same time, equity and differentiation are something that India should fight for.
Thank you so much, gentlemen. Unfortunately, we've completely run out of time. Thank you very much for very sort of cogently articulating the position and the deep vexing issues that this climate change summit has thrown up. Well.